Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Good. Hello, my name is Glenn Denning. I'm a professor of professional practice at the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. I'm an agriculturalist. I've spent 30 or so years in the field before coming here to New York. Worked in Asia, worked in Africa, and to a lesser extent in Latin America. And I would be very pleased to try to answer some of your questions that have come in this morning here in New York. I'd like to focus on agriculture, food security types of issues, but I would be willing to try to take some questions on larger sustainable development issues. I'm also the director of the New York office of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. So we can get started. Great. So the first question I'm going to look at is one related to biofuels. Could you please give us thoughts regarding competition between biofuels and food production? Is this real, or do we have space for both around the world? I mean, this is an excellent question, and one that has been on our minds, especially since 2007, 2008, when we had the double spike of energy costs and food prices. These, of course, were related. One of the factors driving the high food prices was the occurrence or increase in the amount of biofuel, of agricultural crops being used for biofuel. The main one, of course, the most prominent was corn, and particularly here in the US, where there were strong subsidies and government support to plant corn for biofuels, specifically for ethanol. So what this did was, in combination with a number of other factors, put pressure on supplies in relation to demand, and it actually contributed to the spike in the corn prices around the world. Now, certainly corn is still used for biofuels, and biofuels are still being encouraged in various parts of the world, often for purposes of energy security, to some extent also in an attempt to address climate change. I think particularly for the use of ethanol through corn, there are serious questions about the efficacy of that as a strategy for reducing overall greenhouse gas emissions. So whenever you're looking at biofuels, it's very important to look at the whole life cycle from start to finish, and to look at all the costs associated with that in terms of greenhouse gas emission and you know, the impact on climate change. So these days, of course, we really should take a look at today's energy prices, which are half or so of what they were during the energy crisis of about 7 or 8 years ago. And I see probably less emphasis being currently placed on biofuels. So I think it's not quite up there as a major issue right now in terms of the level of support it's get and the level of adoption by farmers. Do I think they're compatible with food security and biofuels? I think there's a place for biofuels in there. I think we just have to be very careful and conscious of the levels of subsidy we apply to biofuels, that it's not crowding out sort of reasonable opportunities to produce food. So let me finish that one and move on to the next question. Let me see if I can answer that one. Yeah, I mean, it's a question about food waste. It's a little bit sort of around about what are your views, how to reduce food wastage in urban centers. Let me just address this question of food waste. I think it's a big one, and particularly as we're looking at ways to meet the food demands of, well, currently 7.3 billion people. And by the early 2040s, we're looking at 9 billion consumers around the world, and perhaps as high as 11 billion by the end of the century. As you know, was pointed out in Professor Sachs's lecture, we will need to increase our food availability to do that. And there are various ways you can do it, and we probably have to use all ways. One is to actually increase production. We have to produce more. We have to improve productivity. But also we should make an effort to reduce waste. And waste is really a very big deal, but it's very different in different parts of the world. We can look at food losses in particularly in low-income countries and among small-scale farmers, and most of the food losses in those settings are food losses that occur on the farm. These are pests and insects, rats, sort of physical damage and loss, and that can be quite crucial for and can really affect food security for very small-scale farmers and for their food security at the household level. But when we look into urban areas, which is really the focus of that question, and we look into higher income settings, most of the losses are occurring at the level of retail and also at the level of consumers. So I think there are a lot of innovations that are starting to emerge in improving the efficiency of being able to retail food and to reduce the losses associated with that. I think part of it is simply recognizing the actual impact of food waste. I mean, not only does it mean we are filling large, vast areas of landfill. In fact, in the United States, food and food-related products are actually the major individual item that fills up the landfills here in the United States. So I think people need to be more conscious about their food waste, but even more so, we should be looking at all the resources we're throwing away when we throw away food, when we don't use it, whether it's the consumer or at the retail or wholesale level. We're not just throwing away the food, we're throwing away all of the nutrients, the water, and the energy that went into producing that food. So there's a huge cost to the environment there. So I think certainly food waste has, my sense is it's actually been neglected in the past. And I think for the Sustainable Development Goals in a couple of different places under the sort of addressing hunger and malnutrition, I think it's important to reduce food waste. And one of the other goals relates to sustainable production and consumption. And I think food waste is a big issue there. And of course, it relates to climate change. So at various points in the SDGs, we should be really tackling food waste as part of our strategy for achieving equitable, sustainable food security going forward. Okay, so let me move on to the next one. So here's a question asking me to explain why India, in spite of having wonderful success in food production, the Green Revolution, and poverty reduction, has performed so badly in terms of child undernutrition. This is often known as the India enigma or the South Asia enigma. And it's something that's bothered many of us for a long time because indeed the Green Revolution was very successful in South Asia and in India in terms of production, in terms of yield increases, in terms of adoption of improved practices. And in fact, this year, India is in fact the largest exporter of rice in the world. So here we have a country that produces a lot of food, exports a lot of food, and you would think, the folks should be well nourished. But that brings us back to one of the core principles, I think, or core understandings everybody should have about food security, and that is that food security depends on three main factors, and that is availability, access, and utilization. Availability, access, and utilization. So simply having available food, sufficient food for the whole country, doesn't necessarily guarantee that people will consume that food. The second point of access is people have to have incomes. And certainly, while it's true that there has been remarkable progress in terms of reducing poverty in India, we still have a large proportion of that population living below the poverty line. And these are people who spend most of their money on food, on surviving. In those situations, we clearly have inequity in terms of availability of food. Now, the third area, and this is probably getting us to the crux of the matter, is that's utilization. And you can have enough food, you can even have enough food in your household, but if those nutrients are not being utilized by the body, then you will be undernourished and you'll be stunted. And one of the reasons for that being such an issue in India and elsewhere in South Asia is very poor access to clean water and sanitation. And that has something to do with population concentrations and contamination of water. But the fact that in India, the improved latrines and improved sanitation is way below what it is in many other parts of the developing world. So we think the main factors that lead to India being quite a relatively poor performer in terms of nutrition, one is water and sanitation. A second factor would be poverty, and the fact that we still have large numbers of low-income Indian families who do not have sufficient food to consume. And I think the third one is more cultural, and this has to do with intra-household equity, and this is the distribution of food within the household, and in particular, women often do not receive as much of the food and the higher quality food as men. As a result, women are undernourished, and when women are undernourished, children become undernourished. It is an intergenerational problem. So I think these are the main factors. It is much better recognized now than it was a few years ago. And in fact, in recent years, the level of undernutrition has started to come down in India, but there's still a long way to go and still a lot of work that needs to be done in the area of water and sanitation. I didn't even select that, but that's okay, right? Yeah. Okay, so you knew what I was talking about. I'll select it now, and hopefully it will be done. Great. Okay, what's next? Biodiversity? Could sustainable biodiversity provide a better comprehensive, let me select it so you can all read it. Could sustainable biodiversity provide a better comprehensive focal point term? Well, I'm not sure what that question really means. Development is frequently perceived like associated with construction, minerals, forests, water harvesting, and so on. Okay, I mean, look, as again, as you would have seen in Age of Sustainable Development, Professor Sachs spent quite a bit of time talking about the way that our desire to achieve food security and our emphasis on increasing production to meet demand has actually drastically changed the face of the planet. 40% of the land area basically is now covered by agriculture of some form. And this has meant that the natural environment has been affected. Deforestation is certainly associated with a loss of biodiversity. So it's one of many factors that are threatened by continued agricultural development and expansion. Now, that to me, we have to accept that if we're going to put 7.3 billion people on this planet, and we're going to continue to grow and put maybe 11 billion people on the planet by the end of the century, the food's got to come from somewhere. And what I believe is the best way forward, aside from addressing food waste, which I mentioned earlier, is that we have to intensify existing land. SDSN, if you have a moment, I would refer you to a report that the thematic group 7 of SDSN produced on sustainable agricultural pathways. And we believe very much that you need to intensify on existing land. We need to get more from less. We should possibly even draw back from agriculture in certain places and allow land to return to its natural environment. But the only way you can do that and meet food security requirements of everybody on this planet is you have to produce more from existing land. So we have this term called sustainable intensification. So we encourage intensification rather than extensification, which means expanding the land area. So by doing that, we automatically, I believe, address we help reduce the pressure on deforestation and loss of biodiversity. Now, I'm only talking about terrestrial environments, but the same arguments can be used quite well for aquatic environments. Our biodiversity in rivers and lakes and oceans have also been dramatically affected by human activity, and more than likely exacerbated by climate change. And again, I refer to the acidification that is associated with increased carbon dioxide levels. So all of these factors actually put pressure on biodiversity, start to shift the species compositions in ways that often lead to extinction, both on land and on water. So I do think that biodiversity is a very important consideration when we look at different agricultural options. Quite aside from the importance of conserving biodiversity, it's at some point we may need to use that biodiversity. In fact, our plant breeding and our animal breeding over the last few decades has been made possible because we've been able to use genetic resources from different species and from different varieties within a species in order to develop plants and animals that have the traits that we're looking for. So conserving biodiversity is an essential part of eventually utilizing that biodiversity and achieving sustainable food security. So let's move on to the next one. We have a lot of questions. Since we're talking about biodiversity, let me tackle the inevitable question that I get about GMOs, genetically modified organisms. Whether or not they are considered a contribution to the UN's agenda on sustainable development, and what are your thoughts on permaculture? Okay, let me start with GMOs. So I like to talk about GMOs within a larger context of the history of agriculture, and that history starts 10, 12, 13,000 years ago with the advent of domestication of plants, of the beginning of agriculture as we currently know it. And as humans moved from being hunters and gatherers, from collecting food from forests and consuming that food as they could, to moving to more permanent systems of actually planting seeds and growing crops, that evolutionary process managed by humans has taken place over much of the last 10,000 years. Different periods of time for different crops, but many of them began about 10,000 years ago. So the first type of genetic modification, perhaps small letter G, small letter M, is that farmers were actually selecting better varieties. So they were looking at populations of plants, and they were selecting the ones that had the traits that they were looking for, probably large grains and large heads that they could harvest for their food production, high yields, adaptation to different situations. And that was really what resulted in the massive amount of biodiversity agrobiodiversity that we currently have today. For example, I spent a lot of my career working on rice. We have over 140,000 different rice varieties that have been developed by farmers. These are traditional varieties that have been developed and adapted to different environments around the world. So we have a lot of that biodiversity. It's very important that it's conserved. But a little over 100 years ago, we started a process of plant breeding where we were deliberately manipulating the genes of the plants, crossbreeding them. This goes back to the days of Gregor Mendel and Charles Darwin, understanding the basic genetics and the way in which different traits can come together and be revealed through a crossbreeding program of some kind. So we've been doing that forever. We've been doing that, well, not forever, we've been doing it for 100 or more years. Breeding was really instrumental right here in the United States. Hybrid corn, for example, was developed at the very early part of the 20th century. And it spread very widely in the United States in the 1930s. By 1940, virtually every corn farmer in America was growing a hybrid. Now, a hybrid, of course, does not mean a GMO. It is genetically modified in the sense that it is crossbred, and the seed is used, and it has hybrid vigor, and it generates higher yields and higher incomes, and farmers have adopted it. The Green Revolution, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, was all about the use, or at least it was mainly about the use of improved varieties, which we never called GMOs. They were genetically modified in the sense that they were improved through conventional plant breeding techniques, not by simple selection by farmers, but we were crossing plants with certain characteristics with others that had other characteristics, and we looked at the result and we selected from the offspring and then did other crosses, and we ended up coming up with these Green Revolution varieties of rice and wheat, which actually led to the Green Revolution of the 1960s and led to dramatic increases in production. Now, the latest generation, which is what is more commonly referred to GMOs, is when we start to manipulate genes in ways where we may be able to take genes from even different species or species or varieties that do not breed in any kind of natural way. So where we have opportunities to do that, I mean, why would we do that? Now, one of the reasons why we do it is that we cannot find natural variability in nature that enables us to use conventional breeding processes. Another way of doing it, another reason for doing it, is it can actually be a much more precise approach. We can be much more specific. Instead of using the randomness of traditional breeding techniques, we can actually use molecular biology to understand, where in the genotypes of the plants. Once we understand the genetic makeup of these plants, we can identify which genes we want in our varieties going forward. And this can be done, and the controversy comes up, of course, when we start to use those techniques to take genes from very different species, even from animals into plants, from bacteria into plants. But that's been going on now for almost 2 decades. It's been commercialized in the United States since the late 1990s. And genetically modified plants, crops, actually cover around 12% of the agricultural land, the cropped land around the world now. It's been mainly done through sort of the big crops that are used principally on large scale, corn, soybean, canola, cotton, but increasingly we're seeing almost as much adoption now in low-income countries and developing countries than we are in high-income countries. And cotton is probably one of the best examples of that. And using Bt cotton. Bt cotton is a type of cotton that, through a bacterium, we're able to confer to the plant resistance to insect damage. So, in fact, there's a toxin in the plant created through this genetic modification that basically kills insects. So we, as a result, we're actually finding that small-scale farmers are using much less pesticide than they used in the past. And this is good for the environment, it's good for their health. There are other applications as well. And I think what we need to do, and when we're thinking about genetically modified organisms and the role of GMOs, I personally think it is not necessarily the answer to all of our problems. I think a lot of the problems that we currently have in agriculture can be solved in other ways. Can be solved through conventional breeding processes, can be solved in various ways of managing our crops better. But I would be very loath to dismiss the opportunities brought about by this modern science and technological approach, because goodness, I think we might actually need them going forward. In particular, I'm thinking about climate change. I'm thinking about the dramatic effects that climate, again, it was elaborated by Professor Sachs, the effects of increasing temperature, the effects of salinity, the increasing challenges in being able to grow crops with less land, with less water, with less nutrients. If we could use biotechnology in ways that, I believe actually could improve productivity and sustainability, I think we should do that. I don't think GMOs should only be used in sort of large-scale farming and wealthy countries like the United States. I think that science should be made available to everyone. One of the, I think, really good examples of that pro-poor biotechnology, which I call it, is golden rice. And again, that was mentioned by Professor Sachs. But there is no known rice variety that has the beta-carotene in its endosperm, in the grain, that we would need so that rice could improve or reduce vitamin A deficiency. The only way you can do that is through genetic modification, through a GMO. And that's why we have golden rice. But a lot of the opposition to golden rice has somehow it's been tangled up with other issues like multinational exploitation, et cetera, commercial interests of high-income countries and big companies and so on. I think we have to look beyond that. We have to be much more practical. We have to look at, some of the problems we have today need to be solved, probably not using the techniques that got us to where we are today. We need to use that modern science to the extent possible. And I think we should be looking at golden rice and many other ways of making sure that biotechnology actually reaches the poor. Because I really don't think the anxieties being expressed by the rich should really punish the poor. It's unfair, actually, and I think the Sustainable Development Goals should be there, to address that. So that's really that's my take on GMOs. I just ask everybody to think very, very carefully about GMOs before they go ahead and dismiss it. I don't think it is the answer to all our problems, but faced, with the risks of climate change, with the challenges of improving nutrition, especially for the poorest in our society, I think we should certainly not take that option off the table. There was a sort of a second part of that question related to permaculture. I won't go into the details of permaculture, but I think permaculture and other agricultural systems that take lessons from that use ecological principles to improve our food system are valid and certainly worth looking at. Permaculture looks at sort of multi-story crop and agricultural systems. We find them in some parts of the world. We find them in some traditional societies. Often permaculture is also associated with organic agriculture. I think again, my sense is what we can do is take lessons from what works. I actually would go out on a limb and argue that potentially GMOs and permaculture are compatible. I would say, why not? If the GMOs would create traits that we want as consumers, then why not incorporate it into ecologically sustainable agricultural systems? We don't necessarily only have to equate GMOs with monocultures. Why not intercrop? Why not move to permaculture? My only other comment about permaculture is to ask a question, why hasn't it really taken on? I think there are some issues in terms of its adaptability and application in settings where there are relatively high labor costs. Most of the permaculture systems that I've seen are found in very traditional subsistence types of settings. And where I have seen them in richer countries like Australia, the United States, Europe, and so on, they tend to be not particularly profitable vis-a-vis non-permaculture systems. Again, because they're quite complicated to manage, and they don't necessarily lead to the kind of economic outcomes that are expected of agricultural land. So when we talk about sustainability, I would refer everyone back to the core principle of sustainability, and that is that we should have economic growth associated with that. There should be economic benefits. There should be social benefits from this. There should be equality, efforts to achieve equity through sustainable development. And thirdly, there should be environmental sustainability. So more often than not, sustainability kind of focuses much more on the environmental sustainability. And so something that is environmentally sustainable might not necessarily be profitable. It might not necessarily be socially equitable. So let me close on that one. What have we got next? Okay, I'll have a shot at this. So it says, the question is, many people do not realize the importance of sustainable food systems, mainly because many people live in cities and far removed from agriculture. How do we get more people interested in sustainability and the legacy of agriculture? Well, firstly, it's much more than the legacy of agriculture, the impact of agriculture. It is a good question, because we're really looking for at the moment, I think we've passed the point a few years ago where the population living in urban environments now exceeds the number of people living in rural areas. And this is a process in economics referred to as structural transformation. Not to be confused with structural adjustment. Structural transformation is kind of a natural economic process of where largely agrarian communities and largely agrarian countries over time improve their productivity to the point where more people move to urban areas, get involved in other sectors like the industrial sector, manufacturing sector, the service sector, and fewer people are involved in agriculture. So you get a rather extreme case like the United States, where which has probably the most productive agriculture on the planet and is one of the world's largest, if not the largest exporter of agricultural products around the world. It only has roughly 2% of its population living and working on farms. So the other 90% of us, we depend, on food production, by this relatively small number of people. Contrast it to many countries in Africa, where the farming community could be 70, in some cases even 80% of the population. So that process of structural transformation takes place. as a result of really a combination of factors. That it includes agricultural productivity improvement, but it also includes investments in other sectors, in urbanization and in manufacturing and service industries. So I think there needs to be an appreciation of the role of agriculture and the role of farming. You know, there are various ways you can do that. I actually do it in my own class here at Columbia. Even though many folks are actually coming from urban settings and urban environments, I think I'm surprised that how much they enjoy understanding where our food comes from and enjoy understanding the core elements of what makes up our agriculture and how we achieve our food security. Once they appreciate that, in fact, it's more likely that they're going to reduce their food waste. If we explain all the trouble that goes into producing a kilogram of rice, 5,000 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of rice, not to mention probably fertilizer and all the human effort that goes into that, you'd be more careful about how much rice you throw out, because you've thrown out, if you throw away half your rice, you might have thrown away 1,000 liters of water. I think building sensitivity to that is very important. One of the ways it's done, and I'm not sure, I haven't sort of scanned through all the questions here, but often people ask me the question, what do you think of urban agriculture? What do you think of vertical agriculture? Some of these techniques that are used to grow food in cities. So without actually checking to see that's one of your questions, I'm going to answer it anyway, and that is to say that I think it has virtually no role in terms of helping us achieve global food security. No direct role. I think the small amount of food that can be produced in most urban, inner city, rooftop types of settings, as interesting as they are as curiosities, I think they have really no major role in terms of ensuring that 7.3 billion people, and in the future 9 or 11 billion people, have adequate food. That said, the one benefit that I do see from this is that it provides urban folks with a more direct connection to their sources of food, and to be able to understand what goes into producing food, even if you're doing it quite artificially on the rooftop of a building or in a vacant lot that presumably won't be vacant forever. Just to understand what goes into that is actually an important educational process. But I don't like to see that becoming too much of a distraction from what we actually want to do, and that is to make sure that everyone on this planet has sufficient food, sufficient nutritious food, and understands what goes into creating both a healthy and a sustainable diet. So that's my little piece on urban agriculture. I'm sure there'll be some responses to that by some of the enthusiasts. Let me see. I'll go down a bit further. Yeah, there's a couple of general questions there about, I'll throw that one up. Sort of reconciling food production and environment. I think that's the crux of it all. Look, I mentioned that the process of domestication started maybe 10,000 years ago with the Neolithic Revolution. At that time, the population of the planet was estimated to be about 10 million people. Okay, that's basically a little over the size of New York City. That's how many people lived on the planet 10,000 years ago. Now we have 7.3 billion people. We have 805 million people, according to FAO, going undernourished. We have the hidden hunger that was mentioned by Professor Sachs, perhaps as many as 2 billion people around the world suffering various kinds of vitamin and other micronutrient deficiencies. We have at least 1.5 billion, maybe as much as 2 billion people who are overweight, and obese. So we've fundamentally changed the planet. Where 40% of our land area is now turned over to agriculture, where the seas have been harvested unsustainably in many parts, such that now aquaculture actually, I think, is recently or is about to surpass harvested fishing from sort of natural settings. So we can't run away from the fact we've fundamentally changed the planet. And again, as Professor Sachs mentioned, agriculture has been a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions through land use change and through the actual farming itself, whether it be methane emissions from livestock or from rice production, from nitrous oxide emissions from nitrogen fertilizer use, and so on. So we have fundamentally changed the planet. We can't escape from that. We can't put the genie back in the bottle. We can't go back to when we had 10 million people. What we can do is really sharply focus now on what needs to be done to move our agriculture and food system to a much more sustainable state than it currently is. Now, I personally believe we can sustainably feed and nourish every person on this planet. I believe we could do it for 7.3 billion people. I believe we could do it for 11 billion people at the end of the century. And so how are we going to do it? First of all, I think we do need to address productivity. And that includes production in the sense that, yes, we need to produce more, but we have to do it in ways that are less damaging on the environment and use our resources much more efficiently. So improving productivity, to me, really involves what I mentioned earlier today, and that was sustainable intensification. We need to use the core nutrients that we have, the core building blocks of the agricultural system more efficiently. And that means nutrients, that means our natural nutrients, our soil, our land. We have to use that more efficiently. Where we do use fertilizer, and we must absolutely use fertilizer to replenish the soils, but whether it's inorganic factory fertilizer or whether it's organic fertilizer, we need to use it more efficiently. We need to make the best use of those nutrients. We need to use our water much more efficiently than we currently do. We need to minimize the amount of energy that goes into or at least make it more efficient, the energy that we use in our agricultural systems, whether it's land preparation, cultivation, harvesting, drying of products, and so on. So all better resource use efficiency will make our agriculture more productive. That's very important, and we have to do so in climate smart ways. And I refer you all to a lot of important literature now emerging on climate smart agriculture, how to improve productivity, but do so in ways that will both mitigate climate change or reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also help agriculture, help cropping and livestock systems adapt to climate change. So the first one is productivity. The second way in which we need to adjust our system is to improve our distributional systems. We have to improve access. So it's all very well to produce more food in one part of the world, but it's not always that easy to move it from one part of the world, which is generating a surplus, to another part which has a deficit. We have to improve the efficiency of our transportation systems. We have to improve the efficiency of our markets so that food can move. Food, first of all, can be produced in places where it's best suited to be produced, and that it can be moved efficiently to places where it's well needed. You know, it absolutely makes no sense at all for every country to be self-sufficient in food. It makes no sense at all for every village to be self-sufficient in food. It makes no sense at all for me to be self-sufficient in food. It is something that humanity has learned to specialize in. So what I would say is improving the efficiency of markets is an important part of it. But markets don't always work. They don't always work for the poor. So we need to have safety nets, social welfare systems of various kinds that make sure that those who, for various reasons, cannot access food have the ability to access food. Low-income people, certainly folks who are affected by disasters. It could be climate or otherwise induced disasters that lead to food shortages. We have to be able to address that. So that's all part of availability. So number one has to do with actually producing more. The second has to do with actually creating access and improved access to all. The third area, which I mentioned earlier today, was food waste. You know, we waste 30 to 50% of our food. I said already that we do it in different ways in different parts of the world. It's very contextual. But surely we need to work much harder in reducing the amount of wasted food, okay? Whether it be at the farm level in terms of improved storage methods, improved transportation systems, improved drying, improved processing, and all of these things. But also, I think a lot of it has to do with behavior, and especially in urban areas, especially in higher income settings, we're way too picky about the food that we want, and we throw away way too much food that has sort of perfectly good value in terms of its nutrition. I think we just have to create a new generation, a new movement almost globally, that looks at food waste in the same way that these days we look at people smoking cigarettes or throwing trash out on the sidewalk or out of the window of our car. Food waste should be viewed very, very, very dimly in this regard. So that's number three. The fourth is we have to change our diets. And this was something that Professor Sachs mentioned in his talk. And one of the factors that is influencing the demand of food and the changing needs of agriculture is a shift to, that's associated not only with population increase, but income increases. So as people's incomes increase, their food requirements change. Now, at the very sort of low income levels, it actually increases their consumption of staple foods. Now, if you're at the very sort of low end of the income scale, if you get a bit more money, you might actually want to eat more rice or eat more corn or eat more wheat or whatever. But as incomes rise, people also want to diversify. And what's happening right now around the world is there's a very rapid increase in animal consumption. Beef, chicken, pork, all of these, in many of, particularly in the middle income countries, countries like China, for example, and India, there's a rapid increase in meat consumption. Now, that one can't be too critical of without understanding the full context and understanding the full nutritional needs. On the other hand, relatively wealthy countries like we see in Europe and United States, Canada, and so on, we eat way too much meat. So I think not only for our own health, but also for the environment, there needs to be a fundamental shift in our attitudes towards what we consume. Okay, so I think was talking about it yesterday to some colleagues. Maybe what we need is a meat tax. Now, I'm not sure how well that would be received in a city like New York, but if we look at beef, for example, as having very negative effects both on the environment because of methane emission and deforestation and the like, and at the same time having negative effects on our health with non-communicable diseases increasing as a result, why shouldn't we actually find policies that would penalize the sale and consumption of such products? We do it for tobacco. We're quite comfortable about whacking a big tax on tobacco because we know very well that people who smoke get sick and cause massive costs to our health systems, as well as, tragedy to their own lives. The same is true with some of the things that we consume, processed food and meat, certainly among those. High sugary diets, drinks, and so on. All of these factors, we can do as much as we can regarding behavior and attitude, but that's a pretty slow process. Sometimes behavior needs a little bit of encouragement through direct policies, whether that be taxes, whether it be bans of various kinds. So look, I think we're pretty much at the end of our 1 hour. It's been a pleasure to speak with you all. I know I've missed lots of questions here, but the ones that I did address probably are the ones that I do sort of feel are most important, and therefore issues that are going to be central to the discussions that we're having over the next several months in terms of framing the Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable food security, agriculture, it's very much embedded in the SDGs. If we look at the Millennium Development Goals, agriculture wasn't actually mentioned. It was mentioned indirectly in goal number 1 as reducing hunger, but agriculture per se was not really part of the Millennium Development Goals. But the Sustainable Development Goals, I encourage you all to go to the open working group document, go to goal number 2, and here we look at ending hunger, improving nutrition, and moving towards sustainable agriculture. And not only do we see it there in that goal, but we see it in many other parts. In fact, I'd actually encourage you to go through the 17 goals at the end of the session and look at those that actually impinge on our food system and agriculture. Actually, most of them, in fact. Sustainable consumption and production, the health issues in goal number 3 that talk about non-communicable disease and the like. All of these things, I think, and efficiency of water use, terrestrial and ocean systems, and good governance, all of these actually relate to agriculture and our food system. So I encourage you all to become more familiar with what's going on and actually to support your respective constituents, your governments, and encourage them to take this on very seriously, because while we'll all in September hopefully sign on to these new Sustainable Development Goals, the real work actually is going to get done in the countries. It's going to get done in the provinces. It's going to get done in the cities. It's going to get done in the villages. It's going to get done in the households. It's going to actually, really depend on you to make these goals real. So with that, I'll sign off, and I do appreciate your attention. Thank you.